Okay, I think we're going to get started. We want to welcome you all to this week's Coping with COVID, Compassion Fatigue is Real presentation. So we will open with prayer, and then our presenter will take over. So let us pray. Holy One, the beginning and the end, and the giver of life, blessed are you for the birth of creation. Blessed are you in the darkness and in the light. Blessed are you for your promise to your people. Blessed are you in your people and your prophets' hopes and dreams. Blessed are you for your openness to us as we seek your will in all things. Be in our conversation today, O Lord. Be with our leaders in their fatigue as we deal with and process and endure so much from so many directions. Stir up your spirit in us, O Lord, and let us hear your voice. Nudge us along as you would have us. All this we ask in your name. Amen.
Amen.
And we are going to be blessed with a presentation by Margaret Day, who is the Community Relations Specialist at Kingston Healthcare. And I will let you, Margaret, introduce yourself even more and take it away.
Not much more to say. I'm Margaret. Thanks everyone for showing up today. I think this will, the presentation on compassion fatigue will speak to each of us in our current roles, and you'll be able to recall past episodes perhaps where you've been affected by compassion fatigue. So thanks for showing up, and I look forward to spending the next hour with everyone.
Okay, you want the slides up then?
Yes, please.
All right. Let's see if I can. So bear with me.
We were doing a trial run, and that's where we ended. Okay, thank you. All right. Some of the references I'll need to update toward the end. There's actually a few more that I needed to add. But so today we're going to talk about compassion fatigue. My initial goal was to talk more about how it affects healthcare workers, just as I've observed, given that I've worked in the healthcare industry for quite some time. But as I researched and read more about compassion fatigue, it's definitely far-reaching. It's not just obviously healthcare workers. It can be clergy, it can be clinicians in therapy, a lot of first responders. It's also folks working with children's protective services, hospice nurses, if you will, and then all of you, I'm sure. So next slide, Sherry, thank you. All right, so with compassion fatigue, and we'll call it CF, it has been described as the convergence of the secondary traumatic stress and burnout. So some people would ask and say, well, isn't that just what burnout is? Isn't that another word for burnout? Well, it's included in compassion fatigue. So you can see how each one breaks down here. And described compassion fatigue describes a phenomenon of stress that results from the exposure to a traumatized individual. So the difference being that you're not experiencing actual trauma, this is why it's secondary, but you as perhaps a therapist, clergy member, or even a friend, if you hear of someone suffering, and especially if it's if they're in chronic crisis mode and you hear it over and over and over again, you are experiencing that trauma with them. So, and that is what is described as a secondary traumatic stress. So Dr. Figley, Charles Figley, which I've learned a lot about in doing this research, and many of you probably already know of him, but he has written a lot of books on CF. But he talks about, of course, the PTSD and calls that primary post-traumatic stress, and then this being the secondary post-traumatic stress. So, and then it obviously with the secondary traumatic stress, it's a result of the extreme state of tension, and it's that preoccupation with the emotional pain and the distress of those that we're helping. And it can keep us up at night in some cases, especially if they're really close to us, a family member, for example. And then the burnout, and that picture there just couldn't describe it any better than just that physical and the mental exhaustion that's caused by, we're just depleted in our ability to cope with our own environment and then those that we're caring for. Next slide, Sherry.
There we go.
So Charles Figley, I don't know if you can see that picture in the upper right, depending on how you've set your screen. He is a world-renowned trauma expert, pioneer researcher in the field of, he calls them helper burnout. He's called CF a disorder that affects those of us who do our work well. I mean, let's face it, we wouldn't be the people that we are doing what we're doing if we didn't care for people, be empathetic, and we'll see that as we go into the presentation. It's characterized by a deep emotional and the physical exhaustion, and here again, the symptoms resembling the depression and PTSD, and the shift in the helper's sense of hope and optimism about the future and the value of our work. There's a fine line. So as we go on here, and it might be the next slide actually, where we talk about, we'll get to it, about compassion, satisfaction, and the balance. So here again, just a little more explanation about the secondary traumatic stress. And after this presentation, I'd like to hear some feedback from everyone about their experiences with CF and secondary traumatic stress, and perhaps even what you might have observed with some of your coworkers or on your teams. The burnout from another study that I read described it as the work-related hopelessness, and you're feeling inadequate, you're frustrated, the callousness and the powerlessness. Callousness, that, you develop a hardness where you just almost don't even care about people or about the work that you're doing. That's a dangerous place to be. So that's why it's good to have interventions. We'll talk about some preventive factors or some ways that we can intervene if we observe this in some of our teams. Next slide, Sherry. So the compassionate mission is any endeavor by individuals to, and this should be our mission too, going forward, to alleviate the suffering of others, not just with those that we care for, but even again with our teams and those around us. Are we aware of the suffering of another, coupled with the wish to relieve it? Webster's describes it as a feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for another who is stricken by suffering or misfortune, and accompanied by our strong desire to alleviate it. We want to remove that pain. And then the fatigue, of course, is that state of that tension, that preoccupation, and the trauma of our clients, and the re-experiencing that traumatic event that I talked about. I was reading in some of the research how you can actually, the disruption of sleep is often a common trigger of CF, because you might be waking in the night and you're reliving the trauma of the ones that you're caring for. We have to find ways to get ahead of that, because obviously with the sleep disruption, it's going to lead to all kinds of other health problems. So next slide, Sherry. So here's where I talk about the balance, compassion fatigue, and then the compassion satisfaction. So finding the remedy, identifying cues that can help you alleviate, prevent, manage. So of course we have high expectations of our teams and our clients, our patients, our church members expect a lot from us, those of us that are providing care or direction, counsel. Also, one thing with CF is that those that fall into it, they view self-care as selfish. I think by now, with all these presentations we've seen previous, the common thread for remedy of combating any of our stresses and fatigue and sorrow is in fact self-care. We don't want to be selfish with that. We can't care for others if we're not caring for ourselves. And this lack of strong personal boundaries. I'll give you an example. I have a friend, and we have a video coming up here, that a TED Talk where she talks about this, where a close friend, where she would always had drama going on in her marriage. And, you know, I felt like, you know, we went for walks and it was a way for her to decompress, and I would listen. And, you know, we've all been there. You give that advice and you think they're going to accept your advice, and they don't. They continue to harbor in their misery, and they wallow in it, and they get comfortable in it, and they really don't want to help themselves. It's so frustrating, isn't it? And I had to set a boundary with that friendship, because honestly, it was affecting me. That's where I felt an episode of CF. And so one way for me to kind of ward that off was I was setting a boundary with that friend. And I said I just didn't want to talk about that subject anymore. So it was off the table. We don't walk together as much, and we're not as close, but she's found other friends to unload burdens on. And I see the same pattern, and it's so frustrating. So that lack of personal boundaries is really important to save yourself and your friendships, actually. That overdeveloped sense of responsibility, I think, is what I meant to say there, you know, and we'll talk about that in an upcoming slide with a chaplain who's done a presentation on CF. We have that Messiah sense, or a Superman sense, that we can handle this. My goodness, we're therapists, we're leaders in our church, we are spiritual, we can handle this. Well, not always. We're also human. So compassion satisfaction is really adjusting your expectations in response to reality. We cannot fix all people. We need to focus on the good. We have to accept the bad. We view self-care as essential to our well-being. Really, the only way we're going to move forward and be well in our practice is to take care of ourselves, and it's good for those around us. And then, just as I said, setting those compassionate boundaries, setting them in love, not in judgment. Next slide, Sherry. All right, so some of the symptoms that I talked about, those sleep disturbances. If you're waking up and you're having those images, you know, and I was reading in some of the research, especially those that work with veterans that are reliving some of the PTSD, and hearing the experiences of those that they're serving. It's actually disrupting their sleep. They're reliving some of that trauma. It leads to a whole host of problems. The anxiety, your mood swings, the flashbacks, you start to withdraw and retreat, the trouble with concentrating, even physical changes. And even more troubling is then some self-medicate, alcohol and drugs, and then depression. And you just feel less trusting of others in the world. You view everyone as bad. Next slide. So some of the work-related risk factors that we all have is, we're empaths, most of us. We wouldn't be showing up here right now if we didn't care about others. So we all have some levels of empathy, a lot of us more than others. Maybe insufficient training or experience. You know, over time, you do develop a sense of what those boundaries are, and you protect yourself. That constant exposure to trauma. hospice nurses or nurses working in ERs, doctors, therapists. Some of those careers may not be 20, 30, 40 years. It may just be, they might be shorter windows, because honestly, you really need to gauge, do you want to keep putting these kind of burdens on your mind, your heart, your physical and mental well-being? You really need to learn to manage them. Some do better jobs than others and can go forward. And that's what we're discussing right now, is ways to prevent. Caring for the most vulnerable in society. I talked about how those that work in child protective services are at great risk for CF. And I do some work with foster children in the community as a CASA volunteer. So I'm dealing with some of those caseworkers. I'm in that juvenile court, and I'm dealing with some of these parents and foster parents. And some of these stories of these kids, it's so disturbing. I actually had to walk away for the last 6 months. There was a case I got so close to with, and if I talk about it too much, I get so upset, but I became really attached to this little boy, and he was in such a really troubling situation. I had to recognize it was affecting me, and I had to step away. Insufficient recovery time. So maybe I need more time before I jump back in that work. Lack of supervision. So I did read about how it's important for supervisors to take note of some of their team members that may be experiencing some CF and step in and help reinforce boundaries, encourage boundaries or therapy, or some type of, as we talked about, compassion, satisfaction program to redirect them. Often some workers, helpers, as Dr. Figley calls them, are isolated and may not have a group that they feel comfortable, or a supervisor that they're comfortable approaching or talking to. Lack of resources. So next slide, Sherry. This is a good video here. It's about 3.5 minutes, and it talks about CF and those protective factors. Sherry, can you play that for us, please? Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
I'm used to taking care of people who are struggling, but sometimes I feel like I can't do it anymore.
Some days are better than others. Today I felt anxious and nervous, and I couldn't stop thinking about my patient's suffering.
Am I even making a difference? After what he went through, I don't know if I can help at all. Maybe I should find another line of work.
She was so distraught. I couldn't take away her pain. I was absolutely exhausted after seeing her.
These are the voices of compassion fatigue. It can happen to anyone, but the people who seem to be most at risk are those medical and mental health providers who care, day after day, for patients who are struggling with significant symptoms. Compassion fatigue is not burnout, and it is not simply overwork. It is defined as absorbing the patient's suffering through the experience of taking care of that person. As a provider, empathy might be your most valued skill. It is also the same trait that can make you vulnerable to the experiences of your patients. And you might find yourself suddenly feeling exhausted, frustrated, or sad. Thoughts and feelings might become overwhelming. Cognitive abilities can be impaired, and you might feel completely lost where you used to feel the most confident. Providers are especially vulnerable when they are busy in their clinics or hospital schedules and find themselves prioritizing their patients over their self-care and connection with others. Any provider who cares for people with trauma histories can be at risk for compassion fatigue. Providers can protect themselves and build resilience by keeping a few simple things in mind. Be with other professionals. Social support among colleagues is a protective factor for providers. It allows you to feel connected with peers, as well as seek consultation or supervision, or even just the chance to vent in a professional and appropriate outlet. Isolation is a risk factor and a warning sign for compassion fatigue, and staying connected reduces its likelihood and severity. Choose optimism. An optimistic outlook is protective against compassion fatigue, as well as many stress-related health consequences. One exercise that promotes optimism is writing a gratitude log. Once a day, write down 3 things to be grateful for. It works. Make time for self-care. In a busy office, clinic, or hospital, you may only have 5 free minutes at a time. Use those minutes wisely to care for yourself. Everyone's favorite activities are different. You might feel best when you listen to music, journal, meditate for a few minutes, pray, or read. Any of these and others can protect you from the effects of difficult work. Compassion fatigue is a risk for any medical or mental health provider and affects the ability to provide outstanding care to your patients. Providers can be protected from the effects of this experience by putting a few simple practices in their day-to-day routines. The work is so important, and self-care is a priority. It's just good practice.
Thanks, Sherry.
You're welcome.
That whole, that part there about decompressing with your coworkers. Working in a nursing home the last 3 months has been very challenging. We came together, the group that I've been working with over at Kingston, Sylvania, great leadership there, some good managers, and we came together as a group last week actually, and I'm observing some CF, but we were able to decompress in a positive way that reinforced each other and our purpose and our mission to keep our residents and patients safe and yet connected to family members. So we were helping with FaceTime calls and Zoom meetings and whatnot. But there's we observe a lot of that social isolation with seniors, and it's wearing heavy on a lot of us. So we came together as a group though, so I could see where that's a very effective protective factor. So next slide, Sherry. All right, so Chaplain Megahan, he has a Facebook page, The Journey of Hope, and I found he actually did a PowerPoint, and I've attached it in the references on compassion fatigue. And he talks about that Messiah complex, or the saint complex. I thought that was interesting, thinking, that we're spiritual, or, we've been trained, we're capable, and we're not subject to this. Well, that's not true. We need to recognize our limitations, and he does reinforce self-care, not surprising. But even that previous video that we just saw about taking those little 5 minutes, if that's all you have, maybe just to say a quiet prayer, or reflect. When I'm working in the nursing home, I would go outside on sunny days, even pause at a window. If I couldn't get outside, there would be an open window. I would pause because we had to wear a mask, and just take my mask down, look up at the sky, and some days it was blue sky and sun, which I was so grateful for, and just take a deep breath. Those moments really helped me. So this Chaplain John here reinforces too that CF is not a character flaw, not at all. So next slide, Sherry. He does talk about these stages, which I thought was really interesting. That enthusiasm stage, a lot of young workers, those coming into the work out of college, perhaps, you're committed, you're available, you jump all in to all the committees, and you don't say no to anything. Then there's the irritability stage, where you start taking shortcuts, or you may avoid your patients, especially those that are in that chronic crisis mode. There's opportunities for lapses and mistakes. That withdrawal stage there where you are complaining, you're neglecting your family and clients and yourself, and that even in a work environment, if you don't have a supportive work environment, I could see how that you could easily fall into that isolated withdrawal stage. And then the point of quitting, you're hopeless, you turn to anger, you appear incompetent, and you begin to dislike people. Don't you see some of this even in today's events with what's going on with some of the police brutality? Don't you think there's a problem there where they just appear incompetent and they dislike people? They don't like their work anymore, and it shows. It's really troubling, and there's opportunities there in law enforcement, obviously. So I'm sure a lot of this will be getting attention moving forward, thankfully. Next slide, Sherry. So Brad Rieger, some of you might know Brad Rieger. He's a former superintendent at Sylvania Schools. And if any of you are Sylvania Chamber members, they did a lunch and learn back in early May last month. And I might have even attached his PowerPoint to this as a reference, but I'll get his permission and I could share that. But he shared something on leadership in light of COVID-19 and compassion. And this is from his presentation. He called it the Resiliency Reservoir. Again, a protective factor. And I don't know if that's his term or if I'd have to look at his references if he pulled it from research, but I liked it. About strengthening your resolve. So, which also was talked about in that video as another preventive measure. Again, self-care at the top. Read and lead. And in Brad Rieger's presentation, he actually gave some good books that he personally was reading. He's now the Chief Operating Officer at Cooper Smith in Sylvania. But he recommended Moments of Lift. I put that on there, that Melinda Gates book. Perhaps some of you have already read it. Forged in Crisis, Nancy Cohen, The Day the World Came to Town. I'm sure some of you are familiar with these titles. I planned on looking them up and seeing if I could order or check them out through the library. He also, I really love this idea about music, and had create a COVID playlist. I had actually heard that too on another program about creating a COVID playlist. Now, do we all want to have that list going forward? I mean, it could trigger bad memories, but then again, it could be the uplifting music that can actually get us through. One of Brad's songs was Tom Petty. Oh, what's that favorite that Tom Petty?
Free Falling?
No. Well, I Won't Back Down.
Oh, okay.
And he recommended, I guess it's an NPR American Anthem series, I Won't Back Down with Tom Petty. He was singing praises about that NPR American Anthem series and recommended it. So I'd like to see, I don't know if we have a chat going here or not, but do you have songs that power you through this season? I'd love to hear what your songs might be, or if you have a playlist. And we did that in the chat for that Zoom, and I really liked seeing what everybody put on. So I personally like the Rolling Stones and a lot of old gospel music. So
I think when Margaret, when we stop sharing the slides, we'll be able to have the chat and people.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, that'll be a good question. Next slide. I would love to hear how people are building their resiliency reservoir. So yes, self-care is not selfish. And we can't care for others if we don't take care of ourselves. So getting out into the open air, I love that photo. Next slide, I think I introduced, yeah, good, forest therapy. So I interviewed our wellness director at Kingston, and she is amazing. This gal was really sharing a lot of tips with the entire team going all through this crisis and giving pointers every day on breathing exercises, some yoga, some stretching, food choices, thought processes, prayer, gratitude journals. But she has a friend who's a therapist in Colorado that's actually been through a wilderness therapy program. And so she was singing the praises of forest therapy. And I have to tell you, for the Nami virtual walk last Saturday, I got out into the woods and oh my, what, by myself into the woods on a good path just at Ottawa Park, even right here in the city of Toledo. And it was a beautiful day. And it was really just comforting to me. And it was just fresh air and just the peace, even in a city park, Ottawa Park. That sound, the sounds going on around you, just that mindfulness moment too, of listening to the geese, and there were golf carts, you know, just the different sounds and mindfulness therapy. I think we're all aware of that practice as well, and that's getting a lot more attention too. But I just wanted to encourage you all to get out into the woods and consider the benefits of forest therapy. Next slide. Oh, this is a good one. If we have, this is about 5 minutes, 28 seconds. And she talks about setting those boundaries with some friends. So carry on, we'll watch some of this.
Have you ever had a friend who went through the world's longest ever breakup? And the first time or two or three, you're totally there for them. You're like, you call me anytime. Forget about that guy, that girl, forget about that person. I got you. And then they went back 5, 6, 7 times. And then something shifted inside of you. And instead of being like, I got you, you call me, you notice that something changed. And all of a sudden, you started screening their calls and kind of having this shift in your ability to feel empathy or compassion for them. Can you relate to this? Now, the truth is that we're all compassionate in a different way. Some of us have a huge pool of compassion. We are the go-to for our loved ones, our friends, and some of us have quite a small tank of compassion, and most people maybe don't go to us very often. So it's not kind of a metric that everyone has in the same way. But I became really interested in this idea of emotional depletion towards people who are experiencing pain or suffering or chronic illness. And I became interested in this in my profession and also as a result of working at Queen's University. So I was a crisis counselor at Queen's University for about 7 years, and I also worked with the military for 10 years. And I'm a trauma specialist and I'm a psychotherapist. And I started noticing a shift in people's energy and ability to be present for other people. But first of all, in their personal lives and also in our professional lives, if that's what we do for a living. And so I started asking myself some years ago, is there a sweet spot between caring just the right amount and not caring at all? So I started researching this. I've been in the field of crisis and trauma for over 20 some years. And about 15 or 16 years ago, something happened that made me kind of pause. So I was working at Queen's University at the time, and I was starting to see a lot of burnt out students, a lot of burnt out residence dons. I had a couple of residence dons that at some point lost their entire year because they were helping so many students who were suicidal or in crisis. And I started to think, where is it that we failed to teach people about boundaries and limits? And how do we get kind of swallowed up into other people's pain and suffering? And is there a different way to do that? I also started seeing a lot of housemates, and maybe you've been through this, where one person in the house is suffering from a mental illness or a legitimate crisis, and the entire house becomes consumed with this person's problem or issue at the cost of their own suffering. So that's the first thing that made me pause, was basically watching students burn out. The second thing I became a little concerned about when I was working at Queen's is how service providers such as myself, nurses, cops, social workers, what have you, were not always the most compassionate towards my clients. And I'll never forget one day I took a very distressed young man to the hospital emergency ward. And don't get me wrong, I love nurses, I work with nurses all the time. But in this instance, the nurse we saw at the triage in the emergency ward was quite frankly an asshole. And I'm not beating up on nurses, there's lots of good nurses, and even maybe this nurse is usually great. But on that day, she had nothing. She had nothing to offer him, she had no compassion, she was impatient. She kind of profiled him. She said to me, oh, I'm sure he's got a lot of money or he's rich. Like she knew nothing about him, but she had nothing to offer him. And I kind of asked myself as I was kind of interacting with this one nurse, I thought to myself, surely to goodness you didn't go into nursing because you hated human beings, right? And I started having the same experience with some teachers, some law enforcement people, a variety of people I was working with. And I work with people who do what we call high stress, trauma exposed work. So I work with the victims of trafficking unit, child pornography investigators. You get the idea, like I work with people who do really challenging work. And some of them seem to do a really good job. And other people, it ends up costing them their marriages, their health, and their ability to be empathic towards other people. And that's what, by the way, we call compassion fatigue. I kind of prefer the term empathic strain. This emotional and physical exhaustion that develops over time when you're either faced with one person's intractable chronic problem or a very large volume of very similar issues. Can you imagine when I worked at Queen's University, how many first-year students came to me saying that their long-distance relationship was going to last? Do you think after the 500th person, let's call her Miffy, all right? And Miffy's going out with Chip, and Chip's at Laurier, and they're going to make it last? Do you think after the 400th person who says that to me, do you think I'm still listening to her, or I'm just scheduling her for after Thanksgiving when you know what happens then, right? It's so common, it's got a name. Because by the way, 95% of long distance relationships at university don't last. I'm sorry if that's you, but so part of what happened for me is I started noticing that high volume exposure to very similar stories were causing me to become a little bit desensitized and numb. And I wanted to make sure that that didn't happen to me because I actually loved my work with the students. So then I start working with law enforcement, and I work with the FBI, and I work with the LAPD, and I work with with the RCMP, homicide unit in Edmonton. I'm doing a lot of high trauma work. And I start noticing that they're having some negative impacts on their personal lives. And it's not just PTSD, which is a whole other conversation. This has to do with numbing or desensitization. The other thing I started noticing in myself, as well as my service providers, is that we might have done a great job at work, but when we went home, we had nothing left. And so maybe we do a tough job and then we get home and someone at home has a crisis and you're thinking, I'll show you a crisis, right? And so I started noticing that some of us were having a hard time transitioning from one to the other. So based on all of that, the students I was seeing, the residence dons, the teachers, the social workers, the nurses, the cops, I started doing some research on the topic of compassion fatigue. We created a think tank a few years ago, and we meet 3 or 4 times a year. And we're a combination of researchers, educators.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Figley calls that empathic strain. Well, he equates it to stress. And she brought up a good point too about how we carry it forward in our family lives and relationships around us. Dr. Figley, so I want to hear about in chat following this video, if those of you are familiar with him. I imagine most of you would be. I'm kind of new to him, but he has a lot of research going back to 1992 on compassion fatigue, and also has authored these books here that I listed, if anyone wishes to pursue those. Next slide, Sherry. Oh, this was great. And I'm not sure we can open this here, but I can forward it to everybody's email, but there's actually a self-test, about 45 questions. And it would be a fun experiment just to see where you're at. So we can get that out to everybody. Next slide, Sherry. Oh, hey, there's my self-care routine. So I want to hear what everybody else's self-care routines are. I start each morning by reading a devotion, Oswald Chambers. It's a daily devotion. And I do one verse for my former husband. I've been divorced for 12 years, but I still pray for my children's dad. That actually has helped me have more of a forgiving attitude toward him, and it helps us to co-parent even adult children. And then I have a history of alcoholism in my family. My former spouse was addicted to pain medications, one day at a time in Al-Anon. So I used to go to the Al-Anon meetings, but I do the daily devotions. And I tell you what, that blue book has saved my life in not just personal relationships, but work relationships, setting boundaries, especially in the last couple years. Oh, and then exercise. So I do my 1 hour of self-care at LB's Circuit Gym. It's right there next to the Nami office. And I walk. I like to get out in the woods when I can. I like Ottawa Park or walk around my neighborhood. Fresh air. I think fresh air is healing in a number of ways, even if you just go to a window and take a deep breath, if you just have 5 minutes. Gratitude journaling, I don't do that. I need to. I try to make mental notes of things that the 3 things that I'm grateful for each day. And there's more than 3. I mean, we all have more than we deserve when you think about it. We really do. So that shouldn't be a problem, finding things to be grateful for. Next slide, Sherry. Erin teaches over at Yogaja, another neighboring business there on Central Avenue at Cricket West. If we want to participate, this is about 5 or 10 minutes, I think, of shoulder, back, and neck exercises. 10 minutes if we want to do it, or we can move forward to the next screen and do a discussion. Go to the next slide, Sherry. I did find, I thought this was interesting, Beatitudes for compassionate care for counselors, mostly those working with grief. We're all grieving something, aren't we, right now? Aren't we? I mean, our lifestyle, things that were in the way they were in the end of 2019 aren't the case now. Things are very different. So there's a lot of opportunities for us to show compassion and outreach to our community, those that we're serving, whether it's in our churches, our practice, our work, our neighbors, our families. I liked this. So the Beatitudes for compassionate care. Next slide, Sherry. References. So I would need to update and include, I do have that Chaplain John's Journey of Hope slide share in there. And then there's some others I need to add, but all right, let's talk. I want to hear about everyone's music list if you have one, or some of your self-care practices. Please share. Or questions.
I can tell you that Kim High at the Metro Parks does force therapy a couple times. If you check the Metro Park webpage, she's very, very good. I know I think it's free, or there's a small charge of maybe $20.
No kidding, right here in town.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna check that out. Thank you.
if you live in a setting where you can turn the volume way up, the credo from Bach's Mass in B.
What is that, Howard?
The credo from Johann Sebastian Bach's Mass in B, but turn it way up.
Okay, I like that. Really? I love
Good.
that suggestion. Yes, volume is everything, especially when you're alone in a car. Hi, Jackie.
Hi, I'm sorry. I guess I'm not. I had my audio turned off.
Oh, I just realized it was you. I'm so glad you're
Yeah.
here.
Just learning to use this MacBook Air.
Yeah. Good job. Okay.
Good to see you. Good to see you. Yeah.
Me too. How about other music or books during this season of COVID and crisis? And how's everyone coping? I want to hear.
Well,
I like the points that you made about getting outside in the open air, whether that's, walking in the woods, or we were able to move during the midst of all this COVID upheaval. We were able to move to our lake house. So, and I'm working full time from home right now, which I love, but it makes it harder to separate work from home, being in the same house. So I make it a point at the end of the day to get out of the house, go out on a boat ride on the pontoon, or sit at the end of the dock and just.
Oh, wow. That's great. I'm so envious.
That open air and
leave.
and get out on the boat and turn the music up loud on the radio.
There you go. Yes.
So just to have a little bit of stuff, because when I work in the office, I have that drive home that gives me that separation between work and home life. And when you're walking from one room to the next to walk away from your desk, it's not quite the same. So getting outside and.
That's a great point. Yeah, that fine line separating.
Yeah.
Not taking that work into our family. Have any of you had CF, or do you see any episodes of this with the folks that you work with?
Yes. Yes, for both. At times, just the busyness of its transition from me spending hours in the car driving around and having meetings to sitting in front of the computer for hours having meetings or presentations and things. So it's different. But setting those boundaries and taking time between has been really important. And then seeing, when you were going through some of the symptoms and the shortness with people and the callousness, those are pieces of myself that I can see sometimes, but then also in parish leaders that just is kind of a trigger or a reminder of how much pressure, that a lot of us are under. One of the things that my girls and I did was we invested in they're paint by number canvases. And so, of course, this is not anywhere near done. I'm about a quarter of the way, but we have spent evenings just kind of sitting around and painting, which is, I've always loved art, but I'm not great at it, but paint by number I can do. And so it's been really fun, and I can't wait until it's bright red. It's a sunflower, if you can't tell.
Really?
Yeah.
You
So
need to share that with us when it's done.
I will do that. So yeah, that's been fun. And the conversations that we've been able to have while we're painting, has been, it's just been beautiful. Yeah.
They recommend that with working with the foster kids, Sherry, about doing a project like that, whether it's an art project, to get them to talk. I found when my girls were in high school, riding in the car with them, just myself and one of them would get them talking. It's the only time we would talk. But
hey, good morning, everyone. This is Jean Dries. I'm showing up as diagnostic phone, so I'll have to look into that.
hi, Jean.
Hi, everybody. You know, a couple things. One that I did, my youngest is 16, and we got a new pet. And I have to say, that has been a bonding experience, but also it just gives us a really positive focus to, you know, focus on a new addition to our family and cuddle and all that good stuff. So that came to mind. And then I was just going to make a comment. I'm not a clinician. I work for a company that has medical staff, but one of the things that resonated with me in your presentation was, and it's not just during the COVID virus, it goes back further than that, is I struggle with compartmentalizing all that's going on in the world. And I think as I reflect, you know, when there wasn't as much negativity, if you will, or various crises such as they are, I used to pause and pray and reflect and kind of take time and then, you know, move back into my normal routine. I'm kind of so overwhelmed with the media and everything going on that I sometimes feel badly because I feel like I've become numb. Like I just read it and go, okay, X number of people were just killed again. Okay, next thing. It's just kind of the world. I'd love any insight in that, because then sometimes I feel really bad because I'm overwhelmed by so much information that I feel almost calloused anymore. Like that's just the world I live in. Do you have any insights on that to keep us healthy?
I can speak from what we've done in our nursing home. You know, a lot of them would have the news on, and they have these big, huge 60-inch screen TVs. And when you're confined to your room and you're hearing that all day, we were trying to encourage music or books online, books on tape, music again, or plays, musicals, and news fasting. I call it news fasting, and tuning out. I mean, of course, we need to stay informed and participate, and but we got to really create a boundary there, just like I talked about with, you know, my friend, or like the gal in the TED Talk. You know, it gets exhausting, doesn't it? And it starts to really affect your mental well-being or keeping you up at night. And there's a lot to be keeping us up at night right now, unfortunately. But I would recommend news fasting. Anybody else?
I agree with you, Margaret. And I just saw something this morning that kind of spoke to me. It was a post that a man named Richard Caldwell posted. He said, "Could it be that God didn't wire us to carry every event taking place in every part of the world at every moment as if it were ours? Could it be that technology has produced an omnipresence that is hurting mankind and not helping it?" And I kind of feel like I've just needed to back off from the news and all the constant negativity. You know, no one person can handle all of that. And I don't think we're meant to. And again, of course, we need to be aware of things, but not just inundated by them.
And positive change starts with each one of us. And then
Thank you.
you know,
Thank you for those insights, though. I appreciate that. I'm sorry,
Right.
Margaret. I didn't mean to jump in. I really appreciate that, because I think that's where I'm getting calloused, is I'm just so overwhelmed with so much that you hardly reflect on it anymore. So thank you, ladies, for that information.
And see how we're doing this, like we're decompressing here. This is our community right now.
Right.
You know, some of us, all of us, looks like we're working from home today or wherever, but this is a good way of decompressing. So I like it. We're doing exactly as we should, as the talk is recommended, to try to alleviate some of this stress.
You mentioned, Margaret, the idea of talking with your group. You said the people there that work at Kingston got together
Yes.
and talked about, and that would be peer, peer group review or whatever there are lots of names for that, and Stephen Ministry has that. And I'm a retired person, retired nurse, but I am in a Stephen Ministry at my church, excuse me. And without that, without the peer support, you can quickly lose perspective. Like, do I have good boundaries? That's a really, just an example. So I just wanted to, say, yes, I agree. That's an important point.
Absolutely. Didn't you like in that TED Talk, about checking yourself? Check yourself before you wreck yourself. I mean, when you start getting that feeling of you don't like people, boy, I mean, Sherry, I've been there too.
Yeah.
I need to push pause, as I say, push pause.
Yep.
And maybe take a day off, like a mental health day, as people say, because you're not helping anybody.
Yeah, self-care seems to be so hard. How do we take the time for that? How, is it really that important? We're seeing over and over and over again that yes, it is important. That, and we talk about it as faith leaders, we can't give until or as parents, right? You can't love unless you're filled with love, so we just have to take that time and build the endurance for this, these struggles that we're living through.
The endurance, the resilience, absolutely. And, that's where we're all coming from, some form of spiritual connection, that our higher power, we are not in this alone. Thank God we have a higher power, and we have a team of compassionate people here, and a good support network. I hope everybody has that. I really do. And that connection, a devotion of some sort, or a spiritual connection of some sort. I imagine we all do, or we wouldn't be here right now in this group. Any other thoughts?
Somebody had mentioned, a couple of people, you had several people's comments on your presentation, and I'm not sure who they were, mentioned the problem of, it is a problem to me, all right, of saying to yourself, oh, I can't take away his pain, or I can't solve his problem. What's the matter with me? Or, you know what I mean? That attitude about your own ability to do certain things. That's kind of a...
And that's what that chaplain mentioned in the Journey of Hope. He talked about that Lone Ranger,
right,
Messiah, saint complex. We have to realize we have limits, and we can't fix everyone. And that's, Al-Anon taught me that too, by the way, because, if you've lived around anyone that has any substance abuse history, you become an enabler, you want to fix them, and we are not capable. So that opened my eyes in Al-Anon to that. It's pride too, by the way. Pride can get in the way of us accepting counsel or help, or that feeling of superiority. We can fix this. So I always will pray, Lord, more of you, less of me, because I get really prideful. I'm going to say I do. I'm very prideful like that, but I can't fix everybody and all things. So, but God can. And I want to be his instrument, his vessel in trying to meet the cares of the world and bettering the world, but I cannot do it on my own, in my own strength.
And other people, most of the time, other people are needed in really serious situations. it's not like, oh, I'm alone in this question. No, I mean, there are other people, resources that can help. I mean, it's just,
Mhm.
you have to recognize it right away, I guess.
Yes. And if you can't, it might be in coming from a place of love, pointing it out to someone in your community, in your team. If you're responsible for people and you see them developing that callousness or the attitude of superiority, maybe you need to call them out or redirect them to spend some time caring, self-care, just living it out. That's my best advice too, is just living it out, being an example. But if you are a leader and you do recognize that someone on your team is becoming hardened, short, making mistakes, or calloused, I think it's our responsibility to pull them aside from a place of love. And that's hard. That I have to pray for wisdom on that too. Well, I wish I had more content for everybody.
Oh, I think this has been very good, Margaret. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't know how much this generalizes from pastors to other people. My guess is that it's pretty much the same across the board. But there are times when I feel pressure to, from myself, to look compassionate when it may be a little more appropriate to be less obviously suffering with the one who is suffering. Less apparently compassionate, even to the point of looking standoffish, not getting engrossed in the issue that's being presented. And I don't know where I'm going with that.
Well, you're talking, from what I'm hearing, it sounds like, ways that you're protecting yourself, but you don't want to appear with armor, that you're unapproachable, right?
Yeah. Well, approachable, but not available to be the solver of every problem.
Right.
And approachable, but not available to feel as deeply as the person who is approaching me feels about something. Sometimes, yeah. But there is often what seems to me like an expectation that I care very, very deeply about something that isn't that major. And I'm quibbling a little bit with one of the Beatitudes from earlier on, something about listening with the heart instead of the mind. I think it's better to keep both of them engaged.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, now that we're talking that through, yes. Protect yourself. Because if you're not available, then you're not able to serve anybody. If you're depleted, you can't serve anybody.
Well, it doesn't have so much to do with trying to avoid being depleted as avoiding trying to inappropriately solve something that I can't solve. Some of this I get from exposure to a 12-step group. I cannot achieve sobriety for somebody else.
Right.
By the same token, I cannot react emotionally on behalf of another person, or react appropriately emotionally on behalf of another person. I can maybe coach them in how it would make sense for them to react. But sometimes I can best do that from a little bit of an emotional distance. And it is related to not being drained myself, but it's also related to effectiveness, I think. If the more responsible I am for dealing with your difficulty, the more I am inviting you not to be responsible for it, but to let me take it on for you.
Oh,
Did that come
yeah.
out making sense?
Well, that sure did.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't be responsible. That in the 12-step programs teach that. So are you leading a group, Howard?
I'm a pastor.
Do you have 12-step programs at your church?
We
Or
do. We are offering space for them. I'm not participating in these, but did in a previous setting. I am not an addict, not because I haven't given addictions opportunities to take root and grow in me. It just hasn't happened.
well, thanks for offering the space. I liked how you just put that.
No, I inherited that.
Oh.
I can't take any credit for it.
Yeah, I imagine a lot of us did inherit some. Well, I mean, we're all
flawed.
Yes, we could all easily become addicted to something, and we have to really watch ourselves. You're right. There's a lot of opportunities to fall into that.
Yeah, and in the language I remember, some people do not become addicted. It is not their fault. They seem to have been born that way. I think in the original, it has to do with people who cannot deal with the truth. There are such people. They seem to have been born that way. It's not their fault. That's how I've avoided addictions. It's not my fault. I seem to have been born this way.
I think in leading folks that it is important to not always be in the middle, but to go up to the balcony, right? And look and try and see the bigger picture. And I think that can be sometimes come across as, sometimes it's healthy boundaries, sometimes it's a necessity. And sometimes, we must have a bigger expanse of the bigger picture of what's really going on. And that's a skill that can be built and needs to be built for more of us, to remove ourselves from the minutia and the kind of craziness sometimes that our lives become. And I think that sometimes that can look like callousness. Why aren't you, like engaging me on this very emotional thing? And the gift is that we can't dwell there. It's really unhealthy to dwell in that minutia all the time.
Right,
yes,
right.
I need to be able to relate emotionally and on a feeling level with folks who are suffering. But we also need to take that kind of a bigger picture and help bring people out of that too, because it's lives are much bigger than an immediate experience that we're experiencing. Yeah, and so that sometimes feels so overwhelming.
I like that picture from the balcony. Yeah, stepping back, and yeah, because sometimes we can camp out in that little huddle of misery and get comfortable there. That's not a good place.
Yeah.
It's something about there's a picture. I don't remember the name of this concept, but there's a picture of a sort of a big hole in the ground, like it's sort of like a big sand trap on a golf course. And so, and there's one person that's in trouble and they're down at the bottom. And then that's the person that you would like to help. You're listening to their problems. And then you are up on the side, but you don't get down into the bottom of the sand. I'm calling it the sand trap. You don't get down in there. You have to stay up along the side in order to be able to help.
Yeah, because
interesting. Yeah.
You have to keep yourself from sliding down in there.
Yeah.
That's another way of looking at it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because once you're both down there, it's really hard to get out.
Get out, right? then the two of you have trouble getting out, both
Yes.
of you.
And then the helper camps out there. And that's never a good place to be either. Codependent, that opens up another discussion too.
Well, thank you. Do you have any final kind of comments, Margaret, that you want to?
Compassion fatigue test, I'd love to, created by Dr. Figley. I'd love to email this to everybody.
Yep, we will do that. I have everybody's email that's on this call. So we'll email your slides and that test out.
It will assess your risk for CF as well as your risk for burnout. So I'm going to take one myself, and so we'll get that out to everybody.
Thank you. This has been really, you have a lot of thought, a lot of important thoughts here, Margaret.
Well, I think, yeah, from the group too, I appreciate the feedback here too. Everybody's sharing, and who's already walked today? Good job. All right, who's gonna walk or go out on their pontoon before the end of the day?
Mike.
Okay. Everybody make an effort today, okay? And tomorrow, and
Does a
try.
boat ride count as exercise?
What's that?
Does a boat ride count as exercise?
The fresh air.
It depends on how hard you pull on the oars.
Yeah.
You can exercise the mindfulness of the birds and take that all in. We'll count that. So.
Okay, I'll take it.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
you. Take
Thanks,
care.
Margaret.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye.
Bye, Jackie. Good to see you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, Sherry.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry.